Hi, my name is Aubrey Graham, and today I'll be reviewing the paper Hurricanes Overcome Migration Lag and Shape Intraspecific Genetic Variation Beyond a Poleward Mangrove Range Limit by Kennedy et al. To introduce the paper a little bit, the study aimed to investigate episodic extreme weather impacts on black mangrove habitat expansion. They wanted to look into this because suitable habitat ranges are shifting poleward due to climate change. Pretty much as temperature is increasing, the suitable habitat range for a lot of species is shifting north. Um, and this really is having a big impact on non-motile species, such as trees, which experience a phenomena called migration lag. Pretty much their habitat or their suitable range is shifting northward, and they are unable to keep up with that shift. And the researchers in this case hypothesized that major storm events such as Hurricane Irma in 2017 could actually expedite the range dispersal and close the migration lag gap. To start, I'm going to introduce their procedure. It's four parts, the first of which isn't really investigative. They pretty much just explained why they chose black mangroves. And not only do they do it because they're unable to move, but they also base it on the idea that hurricane-driven dispersal would mostly impact uh, organisms that have water dispersed propagulas, which could be a really important mechanism for forest regeneration. So moving on to the more investigative side of it, they looked into this by first conducting beach surveys. They established a total of six beaches and they surveyed them for viable propagulas. Two of these beaches were established at the habitat range boundary. Three were well within the range extent, and one was outside of the established range. They conducted equivalent transect surveys on all sites, both during a non-hurricane year and a post-hurricane year. They then collected all of the viable drift propagulas from all of their surveying and they stored them for genetic testing. The third part of their procedure was a vagrant tree survey. They pretty much just drove a boat down the intercoastal and surveyed salt marsh both within the known range and outside of the known range for mature trees. They collected samples from the ones that they found and then they genetically tested the samples. They also collected data on flowering at these sites and collected samples to bring back to the lab to see whether or not they would grow into juvenile trees, and they did this to determine reproductive viability. The last part of their procedure was genetic testing, XSL, where they pretty much subjected all of their samples to genetic testing, and then they cross-examined this against an existing genetic data set to determine source populations. So moving into the results. If you remember, the first part of the procedure was beach surveys. This is the results from that. So on a non-storm year in 2014, they found 0 to 317 propagulas per survey site, and none were found beyond the northernmost extent of the established range. After Hurricane Irma in 2017, they found 329 to 3,048 propagulas per site, and many were well past the northern extent of the established range. The second part of the results were from the vagrant tree investigation. So, out of the 11 individuals sampled across four sites, the samples mostly traced to the southern range margin source, meaning pretty much they came from the closest um, margin source that they could find. So, if the vagrant tree was outside of the established range, it would trace back to the closest known margin. Um, Additionally, the vagrant trees were found to be just as reproductively capable as those within the established range extent. The last part of their results pretty much outlined the genetic assessment aspect. They, in total, genotyped 900 propagulas. 56% of these could be assigned to source populations in the existing database, and of those 56%, 89% came from the nearest range margin source to the sample site. So kind of what we were talking about earlier in the results, pretty much if a tree is outside of the known extent, or a propagula is outside the known extent rather, almost 90% of the time it can be traced back to the nearest range margin. And just kind of a cool thing that was in the results is that the median overwater dispersal distance was 74 kilometers. So what does that mean? Well, the researchers found that hurricanes are actually crucial for the dispersal of black mangroves past the established range, meaning that major storm events actually really can assist with closing the migration lag gap. Additionally, expansion is most closely related to the closest range edge source. And this comes with a couple of side effects. So if a population that is now outside of the known range extent comes back to be sourced from a small population at the extent of the known range, they could experience low genetic diversity, which could come with a host of side effects. However, it could also come with a few positives. One of these being if a population is already at the northernmost range extent, they likely have some adaptations that help them survive kind of the extremes of their suitable habitat range, meaning that the population outside of them or the population outside of that range could also inherit these and be more suited to um, really they're mainly worried about the cold snaps outside of the area because mangroves are very temperature dependent. So finally, vagrant trees are reproductively viable. Just pretty much just saying that populations outside of the range extent are able to sustain themselves and reproduce viably. So, yeah, thank you for listening.